And welcome to everyone who has joined us today. We're very excited for our webinar today on chill landscaping for plants, water, and wildlife, and just kind of covering all things winter today. So joining us for, you can go back. Joining us for our webinar today are Sasha Codet, one of our amazing conservation planners, and Brad Weir, who's one of our awesome irrigation consultants. Sasha has a really large, beautiful water conserving garden that even her neighbors sit outside to enjoy. And she's also got 2 decades of experience as a naturalist, botanical garden educator, and outdoor program developer. Now, Brad has years of experience in South Texas landscaping and public horticulture. He's also our departmental hummingbird whisperer, which we'll get into in a bit. My name is Sarah, and I am a planner in the conservation department, and I'm helping to host this webinar today. So I'll be fielding your questions towards the end of the webinar. Next slide.
Thanks, Sarah.
So before we get started, I just want to go over some of the webinar functions. So at the bottom right of your screen, you should see a chat and a Q&A button. You might have to click on the icon with those 3 dots to find one or both of those functions. Additionally, please put your questions into the Q&A box as we go along. Make sure it says all panelists, so that way I specifically can see your questions. We will be answering the questions at the end, like I mentioned. And additionally, I did hit record on this webinar, so we'll be posting it to the Garden Style San Antonio website. Don't worry if you missed something, you can find the webinar there and a whole bunch of other resources probably in the next week or so. Another thing is this is a Water Saver Awards eligible webinar. So I will post the link for that in the chat probably a couple times throughout the webinar. So next slide. Some of the topics we're going to be covering today are landscape layers for wildlife, so what you can do over the winter to provide some resources for them. Some of the lessons that we learned from Winter Storm Uri, both kind of indoor, but especially outdoor. What we call the holiday watering method, and that's how to water throughout these winter seasons. And then finally, we'll be talking about some of the water saver programs we have available to help you conserve water. Next slide.
So normally winter in San Antonio is a beautiful time of year. Our winters are considered mild and almost warm, or subtropical. And you can go by, and last winter was a little different, and we're going to talk about that. But normally I tell my customers, like, there are 2 summers in San Antonio, and the nice one is starting right now. But we have a winter, you can go by plant hardiness zones that the USDA provides, and people do use these, or not everyone knows how to use them, but it is interesting. In a plant hardiness zone, we are in zone 8B, 9A, and what that tells you is actually what the extreme cold temperature is expected to be in a given year. So for what 8B and 9A means for San Antonio is that the coldest temperature of the year is supposed to be about 20 or 25 degrees in winter, and that doesn't even happen every year. And we landscape accordingly. We can get away with a lot in San Antonio. We grow a lot of subtropical vegetation. We have poinsettias in December, and poinsettias in December. And what happened this year was that the low temperature dropped to 9 degrees, and it stayed below freezing for 100 hours, which is the second longest cold spell we've ever had in San Antonio, actually. In fact, temperatures have been that low 6 times in the past 50 years. Although this was the second longest cold spell and one of the coldest temperatures. But it did, if you pay attention to plant hardiness zones, it dropped if the plant hardiness zones are used to pick plants for winter, it dropped conditions here to comparable to what they are in places like Abilene or Colorado or even New York City. Those are places where they can grow, spruce and fir. Next slide. And we consult those. We at SAWS consult those plant hardiness zones when we're recommending plants that are considered evergreen in San Antonio, the plants that are the backbone of the winter landscape. And so this year, Winter Storm Uri wiped out wiped out a lot of plants in an interesting way. Uh, and you could always, and we're always looking at ways to recover or advice we can give going forward to the future. And the basic advice is it's very hard to prepare for extreme conditions like this, mostly in winter. Winter is the easiest season of landscape maintenance in San Antonio because you just mulch. If you have tender perennial plants or your poinsettias, you'll put blankets over them in the event of a freeze. Um, it's hard to prepare for something like Uri, but you could always consult if we have temperatures of 5 and 10 degrees every 30 years or so. That's within the lifespan of trees, for instance, of long-lived plants. You could always consult the plant hardiness zone 7B, where those temperatures are common. Places like New York, Colorado, and you'll see that there are not many plants that can take those cold temperatures that can survive our summers. Uh, on those lists are always juniper and hollies. But in San Antonio, as always, this isn't a surprise, but our native plants fared best because they have experienced this regularly over their lifetimes and evolved to take it. Next slide. Um, but the damage from Winter Storm Uri was concentrated in a few interesting groups of plants, and we're going to talk about them one by one. Evergreen hedges, but citrus, palm trees, and anything that was a potted plant. Next slide. We're going to start with citrus. And I used to work at the Botanical Gardens with Dr. Moy, and we were, working on developing cold hardy citrus trees, and some of which are sold commercially. The same cold hardy citrus are always recommended in San Antonio. If you're serious about growing oranges and tangerines, you'll use tangerines, satsumas, mandarins. Even Meyer lemons and kumquats can take cold temperatures, but there aren't any citrus trees, not even Dr. Moy's citrus, can tolerate temperatures below 10 degrees. Um, in fact, generally not below 25 degrees. The colder the temperature gets, just the more damage there's going to be. Um, and it's serious tissue damage. Uh, in Florida, you'll hear about people spraying citrus trees with water to freeze it during winter, and they're just trying to protect the fruit. But there's nothing at 10 degrees. There's nothing that can protect tissue on a citrus tree. However, most winters that's not an issue. A lot of people will put up just Christmas lights to keep it warm and just put a blanket over the top. And we'll come back to that. Next slide. But citrus weren't expected to do well below at those temperatures, and palm trees especially. There are very few palm trees that can take temperatures below 20 degrees without serious damage. And unfortunately, a palm tree is a long-lived tree. So if you've taken the trouble to grow a 30 or 40-foot palm tree and you have it damaged in a storm, um, palm trees, in addition, the living part of the palm tree is actually at the very top, the crown, the the heart of the palm, and you see one at the bottom right. That's a Mexican fan palm. And it's
So what can you do, Brad, to protect the palm from freezes or?
For palms uniquely, there is not a lot you can do to protect in a freeze because they're just such huge plants. You can, for palms more than any other plant, by selecting cold hardy palms. That's sable palms, and in fact, our Texas sable palm, the Mexican sable palm, didn't even drop leaves in this storm, which was incredible. That's the one that grows in the Rio Grande Valley. Um, Also, the palmetto, you see the palmettos, that's the one from Palmetto State Park in Central Texas. They were damaged, they lost leaves, but they survived. But you always, with palms, you want to pick the cold hardiest varieties you can get. Unfortunately, the cold hardiest palms do not include the Mexican fan palm, which is that car dealer palm that everyone likes, the tall Los Angeles palm tree. People love those, but they're not expected to take temperatures like this. Incredibly, some of them did survive 100 hours below freezing, and bottom right, leafing out again. Uh, Best advice with palms is once it's damaged, you just have to wait, and you have to wait a long time to see how it's going to do because they're slow. The best example is that everyone's favorite palm. I mean, the most common palm in San Antonio, it is the dwarf sago palm. Not everyone's favorite. It's really poisonous, but that's what you see in the center. And for those little sago palms that people have around their yards, it just took a long time, months and months and months, to see if they were still alive. It's a funny thing about palms, though. They always have that little top knot, like alfalfa and the Little Rascals, where you can tell when you look at that, you can see if it's alive or not.
So cute.
And it's a good thing it was cute because we had to look at it until that. Some of them didn't start leafing out again until August.
Yeah, that's how it was in my neighborhood. There were sagos and different palms that some started coming back, I think, in May and June, but I saw one at least that was coming back starting in August. So like you said, you have to have patience.
Um, I mean, there's a plant that size, you've put a lot of time into it, so why not just wait a couple months and see what it does before you start cutting on it?
And I have a friend who cuts trees, and apparently they smell horrible when you cut them. So if you can avoid that,
The
just wait. Just wait.
They smell like rot. Let's look at the next slide. And if you have questions about this, you can ask us. But we're going to talk a little bit. A unique thing that happened in San Antonio is what happened to pots, just in terms of the effect this freeze had on potted plants. If you think about it, so in the nursery industry, the single greatest source of crop loss is cold temperatures in winter. And in a pot, uh, in cold air, the roots are not above ground. These are plants that are not planted yet, and so the roots are exposed to that cold temperature. You see the rose bush on the left side. Now that plant's in the ground, so its roots are kept warm. The ground never freezes in San Antonio yet. That we haven't had that winter storm yet. There are places where the ground really does freeze, but here, as long as a plant has made it into the ground, it's usually going to be kept warm, or at least its roots will. And if its roots don't die, those roots will spring back a new plant. And we found that across the board in San Antonio. A lot of plants had their tops frozen off, but they were still alive. Um, there is a lesson. Usually, one of the hardest. What people spend a lot of effort covering plants in San Antonio in the winter, and you see at left. That's a funny picture. That's not how you cover a plant. You want the cover to come all the way to the ground, so it's keeping the warm air from the ground. It's keeping the plant warm all the way to the ground. Um, but the damages to pots were incredible, and they've had a severe effect on landscaping because a lot of nursery stock was completely wiped out. And nurseries are still sending out messages that they don't have any upright evergreens, um, which was a plant category we're going to talk about next. It's on the next slide. The damage to these kind of boxwoody type holly and evergreen plants that people use as hedges um, was impressive, considering that these are considered evergreen plants. These are supposed to be the most cold tolerant. But a lot of the plants we use, like Sandanqua viburnum and the xylosma you see at the bottom right, and ligustrum, these are plants from China. They're supposed to be used to cold, but they were wiped out, with the exception of hollies, which you see in the center, and we're going to keep coming back to hollies. The thing is, a lot of the damage to the screens, to these evergreen screen type plants, happened after the storm as well, because people thought they were dead and they started removing them. And a lot of these plants, it turns out, even the severely damaged ones, have actually rebloomed, and a lot of them have attained half of their size again. Um, and so for no category of plants is patience more important. I mean, Mark Peters and I were talking right after the storm. We were recommending, well, maybe you should wait till April 15th before you do anything, and then we said May 15th, and a lot of these plants started actually flushing back in the summer with new growth. The roots are not dead just because. In fact, plants are dormant in the winter, so you can. A lot of plants will be cut back to the ground in winter regularly. They do that at the botanical gardens. They just call it restarting, and they do it in winter. Well, Winter Storm Uri restarted shrubs all over San Antonio, but a lot of those shrubs ended up getting torn out and replaced with new plants from big box stores with very tiny roots, and they're going to have to be regrown from scratch. I'll go on
So,
forever.
so tell us again, Brad, what are the ones that you would recommend? Which evergreen hedges should you put in?
I will mention 3 that did
Mhm.
well. Um, and I guess it shouldn't have been such a surprise, but hollies did really well. Those red, the one you see in the center with the red berries, there are native hollies. The Yopon holly from Houston, which is a popular landscape plant, didn't drop leaves, didn't drop berries, not damaged. There's the native hill country holly, the possum haw, which did really well. But hollies in general, of course, hollies do well. I mean, that's the hollies and the berries did well. The Christmas plants. Um, I will mention boxwoods did really well too, and I wasn't expecting them to hold up as well. And junipers did really well. There's a lot of other plants that didn't, and that includes the viburnums, the xylosmas, even ligustrum. I've never seen ligustrum damaged in a cold before, and it's nice to see that ligustrum can be damaged by something. That's a common landscape plant. People call them discustrums because they do so well. I mean, they're invasive. So I'll go on, but my main point here is just that plant selection really always helps. SAWS has lots of plant recommendations on the Garden Style website, but once you've got plants in the ground, patience helps you a lot too. Next slide. There is one, with that patience in mind, there is a way to tell on a plant, an established plant, whether it's still alive after a storm like this. And I just want to make sure everyone's aware of it. Is you can always take a twig in your hand and just scratch with a fingernail, scratch off some of the brown tissue, and just see what color it is underneath. And if it's still green, the cambium is alive, it's still conducting water. If it's turned brown, and we saw a lot of this year, then some of those branches are dead. On some of my plants, like especially the ebony trees, I was scratching at that tree for a month, looking for something still alive, all the way down to the bottom.
And is there a place that's best to do that scratch test, or?
I would say it's always best to do it when you're standing with a loppers. That's the best place before you cut. So, but actually, people will start off on any branch that you're concerned about, and and you can keep going down until you start to see green. You'll hear it recommended to take off everything above that point, but it'll conduct water up to that point, hopefully, as it recovers. This is a great test. It's called the scratch test. I just wanted to get a plug in for it because it would have helped a lot of people save their shrubbery this year.
I think that's a great practical tip. But you could, like you said before, lose those stems, those branches, but the plant will still come back from the energy that's been stored in the roots.
If you think how big the roots are on these plants after a couple of years, that's power in the ground. Next slide. I just wanted to, and just as a parting note, and as a plug, I'm really into hummingbird gardens, and in San Antonio, because of our normally subtropical weather, it's like a Mexican hotel, and you can have things in full bloom all year long, even in the dead of winter. And I always landscape just to try to keep hummingbirds around because they're interesting. And this year, my garden was in full bloom on February 14th, and a lot of Alaskan and Pacific hummingbirds will come down to San Antonio to spend the winter here because it's warmer than at home, and they can take those cold nights. They actually go into, it's not hibernation, it's called torpor, where their heart rate will drop and their temperature will drop, and it's as if they're frozen on a branch, but then at dawn they warm up and they start buzzing and come out. And they were doing it all through Tropical Storm Uri. It was too cold. I mean, I had the brilliant idea to get reptile heat lamps to hang up around my hummingbird feeders, but wasn't planning on losing power. So they didn't do that much good. But the hummingbirds themselves were able to keep warm on their own. They eat a lot of insects. Actually, that's a big part of their diet in winter. So they're not entirely dependent on plants in winter. They're eating protein.
So does that also mean that one way that you can kind of help them is by sticking to organic pest control, or just kind of
yes, yes, please, thank you, Sarah. But in fact, I think it's better to provide plants that attract insects than to do hummingbird feeders, because it's so hard to keep hummingbird feeders clean, and they can spread diseases. I just keep it out just to attract their attention. But all the hummingbirds on this that you see here survived the winter storm, and they were still there after the ice and snow had melted, which is incredible at those temperatures. I couldn't have I couldn't have lived through that at night. So, next slide. And I'm going to turn this over to Sasha. So, but I just wanted to reiterate that patience, it's always important to pick the right plants in the first place, but once you've taken the trouble to plant and grow up plants, patience is key.
Absolutely. And in addition to patience, though, I think if you want to create a resilient garden, that plant selection is really important too. Um, the other thing to kind of think about is that, you know, your yard has these microclimates, right? So areas that may be warmer or cooler, that have protection from the wind, and that can really help out plants as well. So, and it's something that you just kind of learn over time about your yard, I think. But some plants may have been protected a little bit because, you know, maybe they were planted near a fence and they had that as a windbreak, or maybe they were near your house and so they stayed a little warmer. So that is something to kind of get to know your yard a little bit. And I always encourage people to plant for biodiversity. So having a wide variety of plants in your yard is going to help out wildlife a lot. So, you know, they need to have flowers at different times of the year, fruits at different times of the year. So kind of keep that in mind when you're designing your garden. And it's also going to help protect it against pests, diseases, and things like the freeze, right? So I kind of think about, you know, what if you had one or two plants in your yard and they froze, right? And then you had to replace all of those plants at once. That could get expensive, right? So it's a good idea to plant lots of different kinds of plants in your yard. And finally, again, always going to say use native plants where you can. They are adapted to the droughts and floods and freezes that we get in San Antonio. I don't think I lost any of the native plants in my yard last February, so that was great.
And I will say, as a black thumb myself, like, that advice holds true. They're hard to kill.
So some other things to think about when you're creating a wildlife garden, you know, planting in layers is going to be best for wildlife. They're going to use different layers for nesting and cover and food. So think about, you know, you may want some tall trees like oaks to provide food, or pecans, something like that. And then you might want smaller trees and shrubs that make up an understory. So it could be like red buds or mountain laurels, things like that. And then your next layer down, you might have your perennials there, and finally some kind of ground cover. And so that's going to be really helpful to the wildlife out in your yard. Um, let's talk about mulch. Mulch is going to definitely help your yard be more resilient. It holds moisture in the soil, and as it decomposes, it's going to help enrich the soil. And of course, it acts like a blanket for all the small critters out there too, right? And if you haven't heard of it, you know, we're starting to hear more and more about living or green mulch. And basically that means planting your perennials close together, plant densely. So instead of, you know, more like you see in nature. So instead of having a specimen plant and surrounded by mulch and wood chips, and then another plant a little ways away, tuck everything in together closer, right? So that is a great thing to think about when you're planning your yard.
And I know I personally am trying to take out a good portion of grass in my front yard and put in plants. So with planning that, should I be starting in like a corner then and maybe working my way out? Would that be the best way to tackle that?
Yeah, I think you and I are ambitious and we want to have big, beautiful cottage gardens all at once. But it is hard to do, and I definitely recommend, you know, pick a small section of your yard that you want to remove the grass and plant densely for wildlife and have different layers. I think that's going to be a lot more manageable for folks than trying to, you know, replace a whole front yard or a side yard or a big chunk of your backyard all at once.
And there's an advantage to planting close together like that. I mean, they talk about nurse plant.
Brad, can
Close
you
together, where
put your
one plant will shelter the other.
Can you put your mic down so we can hear you? Or up, I guess.
Oh, sorry. It's did you hear about nurse plants? It's like they call it nurse plants, where it's like one hand washes the other. One plant will protect another from the wind or from the afternoon sun. And so planting close together densely like that has a lot of co-benefits.
Absolutely. All right, so it is the cozy season now, right? And we're always hearing about hygge, if I pronounce that correctly, this time of year, which is a Danish and Norwegian word that and cultural concept that means coziness and, like relaxing and having fun with your family and friends. So I kind of started thinking about my yard from that perspective. How cozy is it for wildlife? So let's talk about some things that you can do to make your yard a haven for wildlife. So some of that might be comfort foods. Um, Oaks produce acorns, which are high energy, lots of fats and protein in them. You may want pecans or walnuts or other nuts that make good snacks for wildlife. And think about, do you have any fruit or berries in your yard? And some of the plants that I think about for that could be like this evergreen sumac, hollies. Think about year round, agarita berries. Other plants can have some great options there too for year round benefits. And it's kind of tempting in the fall to want to, tidy up your yard and cut everything back. But it's best if you can leave seed heads on your plants and your grasses all through the winter to provide food for wildlife, and then trim them back in March is what I would say. And finally, San Antonio has this wonderfully mild climate. And so we get plants blooming, into the winter. I've got Turk's cap that I see, in the winter months in my yard sometimes. Brad, what do you think? Do you have any plant suggestions?
For last year's salvia were in bloom all winter long. There's a million kinds of sage. It's a great winter color plant for San Antonio. Actually, for wildlife, I will remind you, for hummingbirds, having oak trees around, because hummingbirds eat insects, and there's so many arthropods and little there's in the cracks of an oak tree, and that's a great winter wildlife plant. Just to remember trees in general.
Great suggestion. Sarah, did you have one that you like in particular?
Yes, so I am a big grass fan. So I talked about kind of making changes to my yard, and it's full sun. So I'm working towards making it kind of prairie cottage-esque. And one of the plants you've got on the slide here, little blue stem, has that gorgeous kind of reddish brown color in the fall. And I think all the different colors and textures that come out of grass within the range of red to brown, I really love that. It makes me really happy.
Me too. I love that coppery color. All right. Yeah, other ones, asters are good. I was telling Sarah that this year my fall asters were just outstanding, but they were a little bit earlier. Usually last year I had them into December and early January. Mist flowers, things like that are good options too. All right. So providing a water source is also going to be a really important part of your wildlife garden. That could be a bird bath. That could be, if you want to do something a little bit bigger, maybe a water garden or a small pond. And if you have a low area in your yard, you could do a rain garden, right? Have plants that are going to help catch and hold that water in place, let it absorb into the soil, and wildlife can benefit from that too. And I love butterflies. And butterflies do this wonderful thing called puddling, where they slurp up salts and nutrients from like a drying puddle. And so, if you have a sandy area or bare earth area in your garden, maybe consider leaving it for butterflies. If you don't, you could take a shallow pan and fill it with sand or soil, put some flat rocks in there for the butterflies to land on, and then fill it with water and let them enjoy that. Yeah, it's always important to remember to put rocks in these bird baths and ponds to prevent small animals from drowning. All right. And a final thing to consider would be planting evergreens, like Brad mentioned, that they can hide in. I would say, I kind of looked over my yard last February and thought about, where are all the birds and the squirrels and all the little critters in my yard? And we had some evergreen bushes that were just all aflutter. But I thought about how could I improve that this year? This fall is a good time to be planting, right? So think about maybe adding some evergreen shrubs to your yard, including bunch grasses, which can provide good cover. And again, think in layers, planting in layers. And wildflower gardens, little meadows are becoming very popular. So you might consider doing something like that if you have room. If you don't, just include some bunch grasses in your yard, like that side yard picture in the bottom right. If you have dead trees or logs, if it's safe, you can keep them, and that's going to provide great habitat for wildlife. Those woodpeckers will be in there, and lots of other birds, like Brad said, might be picking the little spiders out of the cracks between the bark. So if y'all are interested in learning more about gardening for wildlife, we actually have a great section of our website, gardenstylesa.com. And if you look in the garden resources at the top, you're going to find this Gardens for Wildlife section. And it's got information about water, plants, just Wildscaping 101 if you're brand new to it. And then even designs. I think Brad has a landscape design for hummingbirds in here. So you can print that plan out and be ready to go. And while you're on our website, please do check out our Find a Plant section. It's got hundreds of different water-saving plant selections. You can use the filters along the right side here that can help you, if you want to choose a small shrub, or if you want to search for something that's evergreen or deer resistant, or hummingbird, pollinator friendly. These are great places to look for plants that are going to do well here in San Antonio. So make sure you check them out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So Sasha and Brad have gone over things, especially around, plant selection and planning. But just as important during this time of year, especially if you have an automatic irrigation system, we just got a question about it, is how to be running your system or how to be watering during the winter. So something that's kind of surprising to a lot of people is that, especially during December, January, February, you actually don't need to be really watering at all. And one thing that we recommend for doing this without having to go out to your controller every month and change the settings on every single zone is using what's called the seasonal adjust feature, which we'll go into here in a few minutes. And if you follow a seasonal adjust schedule, you'll actually save up to 30% on your annual water use. And we recommend that you water deeply and infrequently during the winter time. So next slide. And this is what I was talking about with the seasonal adjust button. So on most controllers, it should be its own dedicated feature. And it's really cool because you can just change it to that one setting and adjust the percentage. And it will automatically change the runtimes on all of your zones across your controller. You don't have to go into them. So for example, if you're running a zone for 10 minutes and you change the percentage to 80%, that zone will now be running for 8 minutes and so on. So you can find how-to videos on our website at gardenstylesa.com. You can also schedule an irrigation consultation with Brad, for example, and he will actually come out, he or one of our other staff members will come out to your home and show you kind of how your controller works and how to use something like your seasonal adjust features. And we've also got some really cool stickers that they can leave behind with our recommendations for percentages. Sorry, next. Oh, yeah, next slide. And then there's also what we call the holiday watering method. And this is once a month watering, kind of just to run your system, make sure things are up and functional. And Brad, remind me, what are the specific holidays that we want to be running the system on?
Normally at this time of year, actually with the weather this week, is a perfect example. We tell people that at Halloween you can start. You're not going to need the weekly watering schedule anymore, as long as it gets a deep watering once a month uh, during the dormant season, which is beginning for grass. Um, so the holidays are Halloween is the first, but definitely by Thanksgiving. And this is the idea that just once a month you'll check the weather. And if it hasn't rained, if it's been hot and dry, which it can be in San Antonio, then you'll want to check the weather once a month on the holidays: Thanksgiving, Christmas, Martin Luther King, Valentine's Day. Um, and just if it needs water, if it hasn't had a good rain that month, you might run the system once. It actually helps lubricate the valves. But the last holiday is actually spring break or fiesta. And that's when you start that weekly watering if you're trying to grow, if you're trying to give at least a half inch to turf grass once a week.
Perfect. And then next slide. So something else that we have available is what's called our Smart Irrigation Controller coupon. And this is a $100 coupon off of a Smart Irrigation Controller. Right now, the one that we have covered in our program is called the Ratio. And what's really cool about this is you can control your irrigation from your phone. So for example, if you travel, especially during the holidays, you could find this really helpful because I'm very forgetful. If I'm out of town for Thanksgiving, I might be like, oh, it's Thanksgiving Day. Today's the day that I need to be running my system for the month, but I'm out of town. And you could easily run through your system from anywhere. You can be in the state, in the country, in another country. And so it gives you that access to your system from wherever. Now, that being said, or specifically the Ratio, has weather-based watering. And this can be beneficial because it will make decisions about when to water for you. But a couple things you want to be mindful of are in the summertime, you'll want to stick to a set schedule, and that's to ensure that it's not overwatering because it can raise your water bill if you're not keeping an eye on when it's deciding to water. And additionally, you want to be mindful when we're in drought restrictions because the Ratio might not necessarily know that you have a limit on your watering day and what times of day that you can water during. So that's another time that you want to be very mindful about using a fixed schedule with any kind of smart controller, honestly. So next slide. And then another thing we want to bring up is Water Saver Rewards. So this is it's a point-based system. You can sign up at gardenstylesa.com/rewards, and I'll post a link in our chat again. And the way it works is you attend workshops that are on our calendar or webinars, like this one today is a rewards point eligible webinar. And as you attend these events, you get points that you can use to get discount coupons. So $30 towards a rain barrel or a gardening tool, $50 towards mulch or compost. And then at the end, when you hit 7 points, you can just get a $70 coupon to one of our approved vendors. So if you're not already a member, I would recommend signing up. And for our webinars, you do have to take a quiz afterwards. And you will need a code word. And so today our code word is Holly, Holly. So be sure you write that down because you won't be able to get your points from taking the quiz if you don't have that code word. So be very sure that you write that down and remember it. Next slide. So again, yes, the code word is Holly, very important. Don't forget it, write it down, write it on a sticky note, on your hand, on a piece of paper, whatever works for you. Next slide. And additionally, like I said, I'll be posting the link for the quiz again in our chat. You can also find the quiz on the Garden Style San Antonio website. You can click on the event and there's a link in there. And you should also be auto-directed when the webinar ends to the quiz survey link. Next slide. So now that we've reached the end, we've gotten a lot of really good questions, and we don't have a ton of time. We've got maybe about 20 minutes, so we'll get through as much as we can. But if we're not able to reach your questions today, feel free to reach out to us. You can also submit questions any time of year to the Garden Week on gardenstylesa.com. And if you're interested in scheduling, say, Brad, for an irrigation consultation, you can reach out to us by calling our conservation line, which you can find all that information again on our website. Okie dokie. So let's get started with questions. And just as a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A over at the chat. So we got quite a few questions specifically about mulch. So people were asking, first, what is a good mulch to use? And they specifically said they've seen the stuff at Home Depot that's dyed, but they're not so much into that look. So do y'all have any recommendations about mulch?
Yes, I always recommend cedar mulch, and I can't resist. It's not dyed. It's native. It's long lasting. It's actually a bit of an insect repellent. Smells good.
Yeah,
And it's homegrown.
It is homegrown. See, so there was another question about pros and cons for mulching versus xeriscape, and I think kind of in a similar line, someone else asked if their plants are close together. Sasha, like you had talked about, is mulching still something they need to be concerned about doing?
I think you may be able to get away without mulching too much because I would bet some of those plants lose their leaves and then they drop and return to the soil. Um, to me, you might use mulch to have a layer there to hold the water in the soil and to kind of have a polished look. But if it looks, good with your plants all filled in, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think you're probably okay. I think I tend to mulch every other year or every third year, just depending on how my garden's looking.
Perfect. And I guess on the topic of pros or cons of mulching versus xeriscape, right now my yard is sitting in a mulched state where it's just mulch and I haven't planted anything yet. And I've been fighting off Bermuda. So that's been a very hard battle for me. So I think like Sasha said, starting small makes it easier to tackle.
Yeah, mulch will help keep weeds out, but in my experience, it doesn't generally do it for more than 2 years or 3 years. And then it needs a little refresher. Weeds are just a part of life, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. So we have some plant-focused question. One person was asking about, they said their fig tree did survive the freeze. However, the fig size ended up being small, and kind of asking if this is normal. I know, Brad, we had talked about my mysterious lemon tree in a pot that survived the freeze. So were there any factors that prevented and kept some of those fruit and citrus trees alive?
You mean factors that cause the fruit to be smaller? For
Well,
sure.
factors, yeah, I guess just that like allowed them to survive, and then
So factors that allowed and figs like citrus do not love cold. But a plant that is in a pot that's protected, um, especially by I mean it's called south wall protection in San Antonio. If a plant is on the south side of the house, protected from the north wind by a wall, that's a good location that protects it from the wind, keeps it warmer, and the wall will radiate heat because the sun is in the south in the winter. So overnight, the plant's kept warmer. Um, for plants in pots, I mean, we used to be able to say, well, it's great to keep fruit trees in pots because you can drag them around and bring them inside in the winter, assuming that it's going to be warmer inside than outside. Um, but we did talk about in Italy, in the winter, they'll take figs that are in pots and bury them in the ground. They just tip the pot over and cover it with earth, um, which normally figs are able to overwinter here, but they were. I'm assuming fruit size is dependent on a lot of conditions, and a lot of plants were in recovery this year.
Mhm. Okay.
I hope
Another
that helps.
specific plant question. Well, what are some of your favorite shade-friendly native plants that would kind of weather the winter and the summer? I know shade
What do you think?
plants, yeah.
Cedar sage? Some of the maybe, let's see. I know, Brad, you like shrimp plant, but that's not
It's useful for
native.
hummingbirds. I don't love it. So it's it's not quite native, but it's native to northern Mexico. I mean, there's so many. You can actually go on Garden Style SA and you can pull up the shade plants depending on how deep the shade is.
Turk's cap,
Turk's
yeah, you
cap is
mentioned.
a great one.
Those are my two favorites.
Can't go wrong with Turk's cap.
Perfect. And then what is the role of understory in things like native plants and during freeze, or I guess plants in general? So Sasha, for example, you were talking about that dense planting. Does that help with plants weathering the weather?
Yeah, I think part of what understories and trees and canopies do is kind of help hold in that warmer layer of air above plants. So I think that's kind of the effect there.
Okay. And then we've got quite a few questions as well about irrigation. So one question about drip, should it be run at all during the winter?
I mean, it depends what you're trying to grow. I always it's if you if it rains heavily once a month, I don't think you have to run drip any more than anything else. The plants in the landscape beds that you water with drip are generally much more drought tolerant than the grass is. That's a surprise to a lot of people. I water drip manually as needed in winter and actually in summer once plants are established. However, if you're growing vegetables or if you're growing lettuce or corn or whatever, um, it just depends what you're growing.
Okay. And then also on the topic of irrigation, if you don't have an irrigation system, should they be manually watering once a month? And how long should they be watering if they're using a hose and sprinkler system?
I think if you're using a hose to water, you're always going to use the right amount. um, but again, it's a watering is only in the absence of rain, and um, the only thing I think a lot of people do plant new plants in the winter. It's a great time to add, especially for trees and shrubs. It's a great time to establish them. So if you're watering them with a hose in winter, you want to keep it moist but not wet. I always do the finger test where you just put a finger into the soil and see if it comes out sticky, then that's too much water. Um, but usually just a minute on a watering and just test it constantly. Depends on the size of what you're watering. Uh,
Perfect.
I hope
So
that helps.
yeah, what about perennials? Should those be watered in winter? Do they need some sort of special attention?
I think that's
I,
once a month watering, right?
so, or less even. It just
That would
depends. I mean,
still
they'll
apply
have,
to them.
yeah.
Mm.
Okay.
I mean, if they, so perennials will, uh, if needed in winter, winter is a time you can get away with a lot. But if they're new, if you're doing like a new landscape, um, you want to establish new plants. You can use the 3-2-1 method. For the first 3 weeks, you water 3 times a week. For the next 2 weeks, you water twice a week, and after that, once a week is fine.
Yeah, I never water any of my native plants in the winter. And
That's right.
any year, they're always fine. They're adapted to
Yeah.
our area.
Yeah, I'm telling you, black thumb, I neglect, and they just do their thing, and they're happy. I don't know.
I didn't have to water it all last winter. The only water I had to use was for the hummingbird feeders.
Perfect. So someone had a question about the Ratio, the Smart Irrigation Controller coupon, and they asked, do you have to already have an irrigation system and the Ratio is just a controller, or is the Ratio the irrigation system itself? So the Ratio is just a controller. It is designed for someone who already has an irrigation system. So it's actually something, if you're technologically savvy, you could install yourself. After an experience with my thermostat, I've learned to not do those things because I ended up without AC for 2 days. But yeah, just the controller is the answer to that. So Sasha, again, kind of going back to your recommendation on the dense planting, are there any rules of thumb for number and variety of plants to put together so they're not too crowded or too thin? Because I know sometimes nursery plants, like rosemary, for example, looks very small and then it becomes not small at all.
Yes, that's correct. So usually a plant will have a tag on it that is going to tell you how big it gets to be. Or if it's one of the ones that you find on our gardenstylesa.com website, we have the plant sizes in there too. So I think, you could plant and plan ahead so that you're going to give them space to grow, but just bring them in just a little bit closer. So, you may have that more specimen look in the early years while they're filling in. But I think it's a good idea to leave them a little bit of space too.
Perfect. You'd also talked about making water sources for wildlife during the winter. And one person asked, what can be done to keep those water sources from basically turning into mosquito farms?
Yes.
That's a great question. It's a lot easier to do that in winter than in summer. Um, uh, in winter, you're not going to have a problem with mosquito farms, I don't think. But in summer, you'll have to change. I mean, it's not a bad idea to change out bird baths, really.
2 to 3 times a week.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
or even every day, and to empty them at night. Actually, it's not something a lot of people think of. Or to keep the water just circulating constantly. And you can even get those little solar powered sort of bubblers for a bird bath. Mosquito farms, you are correct.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. On the topic of plants that weathered winter well and didn't, one person was wondering kind of what happened to century yuccas over the recovery period.
Uh, they looked pretty bad, didn't they? I mean, and century yuccas freeze like that. So every couple of years, any cold temperature is just going to turn it into just pulp jelly. Um, some of them survived. Some there are yuccas in West Texas that survive those kind of temperatures. But the big century yuccas looked pretty hideous afterwards. However, you find out once the big plant was gone or had melted, you found out there were so many pups underneath that a lot of those plants are still big piles of yucca, of century agave. Sorry. Um,
Pick a pup maybe and let it fill in.
yeah, pick one. Pick one. You only need one. I mean, they do century plants. Once they make that big flower stalk, they die. So, uh, and then there's usually a lot of pups left over afterwards.
Okay, and then what about like kind of tree health after the winter? I know like I had a tree that started sprouting branches from the trunk. Someone else seems to have had a similar issue. And I don't know, is that something like the tree's done, still got a chance, wait it out some more?
I mean, the trees were damaged. I mean, I had a mountain laurel that died, and mountain laurels they don't die. So I think you're probably actually a lot of trees, especially loquats is a good example. Loquats they still look terrible because they had already started making their leaves when the cold hit. So technically, they won't make leaves again like that until this year. So for some trees, you may be waiting one more season just to see if in spring And spring sometimes is February. If in February it'll start to put out new growth, maybe that's the longest I would. I mean, after that, that's the longest but after that, you should know what the situation is, if that helps.
Perfect.
Mark
And then
Peterson will have an opinion about this, and you can
You can
write him
ask
at
the garden
Garden
geek.
Geek. Yes.
you can ask the garden geek, yeah. So I think we've just got 2 more questions. So again, another specific question on plants. Is this a good time of year to be planting holly? I know you had said trees and bushes, right? So holly would fall within that.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. You were talking about Yopon holly, I think. Yeah, this is perfect time to
Okay.
plant trees and shrubs. Even better now than to wait until March.
Perfect.
That's often a surprise to people. A small plant in a pot is more tender. Its roots are smaller, so it's not a bad idea, depending on what you're planting, to try to keep it warm this year. Normally, all that's going to take is a blanket.
Okay. Perfect. And then we did get a question about the Ratio coupon. Just to clarify, the way that works is you have to go to the Garden Style website and submit an application. It is a program that I run, so I will approve it. And then at that point, you get a coupon code. So if you have any questions, please shoot me an email, or if you're having any issues with the application, I'm happy to get you set up and figure out what's going on. So that concludes our webinar for today. So I want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. Thank you, Sasha and Brad, for this amazing presentation. Winter's approaching faster than we know, and it's already November. And I know we're all pretty focused on making sure we're ready for it. So don't forget to take the Water Saver Rewards quiz to get your points. The link is available on the events calendar, and the quiz is only open for today. So make sure you've got your code word, you get it done today. Thank you, both Brad and Sasha, for the winter garden expertise, and we hope you have a safe and warm winter. We'll look forward to seeing you all next year.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Those are great questions. Thank you.